and welcome to a truly special edition of the Oddity Archive. Special in that this is the episode in which I finally attain control over space and time. Would you believe time? Would you believe I kinda sorta half learned to use a lamp timer? Regardless, we have come to the end of yet another season of Archive, and as has become kind of the unintentional custom around here, I want to end it with one of my more long-term projects. So with that, today we're going to look at another one of my little oddball video formats. But in this case, this is, I guess you could say, a fifth wheel. When we think of the format wars, we usually think just Betamax and VHS. And when it came down to recordable, tape-based home video stuff, those really were the only two that mattered commercially. But just in North America alone, there were actually 4 horses in a 2-horse race. And if you factor in Europe, at least another 2. But one of those 2 extra horses, if you will, here in the States was this little thing that only came out in Japan and North America called the VX format. Here in North America, kind of colloquially known as the Great Time Machine. But here's one of the Japanese tapes, or at least the box for it. So anyway, as for the VX format, I couldn't tell you in a million years definitively what VX even stands for. And that kind of proved to be emblematic of this whole project. So initially, I really wanted this to be a more or less episode-length history lesson. But as it turns out, the history of this format is just as enigmatic as the format itself. So I've had to kind of downsize things. So what you're going to see today are 3 segments. One being an admittedly largely speculative history lesson. One being a look at the more noteworthy and just quirky parts of the VX tapes and VCRs. And then we'll close things out with some choice moments from the 15 or so tapes that I've accrued over the last 5 months that I've had my great time machine, my control over time and space. But anyway, I still have a fair amount to get through here, so let's get down to business. The 2 reels are stacked on top of each other, which just kind of feels more like trying to avoid a lawsuit. Maybe a Sony going after these companies for copying the U-matic, having 2 reels side by side. Contrary to a statement I made in my little documentary, after digging around a little more, I'd be willing to bet heavily that the VX video format, Video Express, Vietnamese xylophone, I don't know. It was actually a part of the glut of pre-Betamax stabs at a consumer-grade home video format. In this case, one that just didn't get released until after Betamax. Among the released pre-Betamax formats were the Motorola EVR, which actually used film, the Sony U-matic, whose marketing was almost instantly shifted to professional circles, Cartravision, alas, Genie not included, and the original black and white Sanyo V-Chord, not to be confused with an 8-track. In probably the summer of 1975, the VX format debuted over in Japan with the Matsushita, or Matsushita if you prefer, VX100. Anecdotally, at least. I can't find so much as a picture of this thing. Having said that, I did find a couple of uncited sources that list the VX100 as being generically marketed as Autovision, which also got me nowhere. It's also worth noting I also dug around for Matsushita VX1000, but got no results for that either. The reason I searched under VX1000 at one point was that the second and final VX VCR was the National VX2000. The Sony Betamax debuted in Japan in May of 1975. At this point in time, VHS was still unfinished and under lock and key by JVC. As such, it's worth speculating that Matsushita rush released their existing VX format to compete with Sony. If anything, it would make a certain degree of sense. The one and only Betamax machine on the market at the time of the VX format's debut was the, of course, Sony LV1901, which was only available as a complete TV and VCR console. Either later in 1975 or in early 1976, the second and final VX VCR was released, once again only in Japan. This was the National VX2000, also marketed generically as Home Vision. The VX2000 retailed for 210,000 yen, about $1,500 American at the time. If it hadn't dropped already, by no later than early 1976, Sony released their first standalone Betamax deck, the Japan-only SL7300, which, as best as I can gather, sold for around the same price as the VX deck. By late 1976, Matsushita opted to give the VX2000 a North American release by way of American subsidiary Quasar, as model VR1000, generically marketed as the Great Time Machine. It hit the market at the beginning of 1977. And speaking of Great Time Machine, you could also buy an outboard timer unit to help achieve your time travel. It ran you an extra $50. Not bad for time travel. Anyway, by the time of VX's North American release, VHS had already debuted in Japan, but hadn't arrived in North America yet. By the same token, by this point, Matsushita was working in tandem with RCA to develop a half-speed, and by turn 4-hour version of JVC's VHS format, which would drop in October of '77. So even though Panasonic, North American Matsushita, was already planning VHS decks under their own name and the Quasar brand to boot, Matsushita opted to effectively preempt their own forthcoming VCRs. When the Great Time Machine hit the market, it retailed for $995. As far as I know, it was the first VCR to, at full retail at least, break the $1,000 mark. As of early 1977, it also had a leg up on Betamax in that you could get an hour and 40 minutes of recording time on a single tape, soon bested by 2-hour tapes. At the time, Beta still only topped out at 1 hour. Of course, over the next several months, the first Beta decks to record at half speed were introduced, and around the same time, the North American rollout of VHS occurred, which was capable of 2 hours right out of the gate. And Quasar themselves got their first VHS deck out the door by the end of 1977. If Quasar's public statements are anything to go by, and do take them with a serious grain of salt, the Great Time Machine was intended as a quote-unquote budget VCR. And I guess it makes some sense. The mechanics were a bit simpler than most others, which allowed for lower manufacturing costs, which led to a VCR that was to the tune of $250 to $300 less than a Betamax at the time. But that theory kinda falls apart when you consider that the tapes themselves were invariably more expensive and much harder to find than Beta or VHS tapes. One ad I found from the summer of 1978 shows a lot of 10 2-hour tapes selling for nearly $40 more than a dozen equivalent Sony brand beta tapes. By late 1977, the VR1000 was already selling for as low as $700, with no prospects for other manufacturers to start making their own VX decks. And the only pre-recorded tapes were confined to a few pornographic titles, Japan only. Also, I've found no evidence whatsoever that any new, especially North American decks were manufactured after late 1977. If anything, I've got a conspiracy theory that some parts of the decks were actually reused from either unsold Japanese VX2000s or leftover other Quasar appliances. Parts of my own machine appear to carry a July 1975 date stamp. If Matsushita ever meant for the VX format to be anything more than a stopgap release prior to VHS, in North America at least, it certainly doesn't show. The last reference I could find to new VX tapes dates to March of 1979 in issue number 18 of the video file. Even when purchased in a box of 5, they were now selling for over $25 a tape. At their best, equivalent beta and VHS tapes were down to about half that by then. Any ads you see, especially for the VCRs, from 1978 on, and I've seen them from as late as the fall of 79, yeah, they were simply trying to unload old stock. The final nail in the coffin for the VX format, weirdly enough, comes from the first few Quasar VHS decks, which carried over the Great Time Machine name, as if the VX format never happened. The VX format, both the tapes and VCRs, had a few quirks and a few shortcomings. First and foremost, like specifically early Betamax and early VHS, the tape stock was basic ferric oxide, like you'd find in a basic Type 1 audio cassette. However, unlike Beta and VHS, VX tape was raw, unlubricated half-inch tape stock without Mylar backing. If I may get slightly hyperbolic, it was slightly akin to running ultra fine-grained sandpaper through your VCR. Another quirk of the tape was that it never exits the cassette. The tape lives on two stacked reels, supply on the bottom, take up on the top. In between, the tape does a full 360-degree wrap around a plastic core within the cassette. When the cassette is placed into the VCR, the core is removed by sliding a metal bar to the right, and of course it's put back in when you slide the bar back to the left. Anyway, when that core is removed, the 360-degree coil of tape is kept intact, just now it's wrapped around the video head. Speaking of which, Beta and VHS decks always ran on at least 2 video heads, at the very least one to read and one to write. VX only had one. The recording and writing of the video end of things got mashed onto a single tiny electromagnetic coil of sorts, effectively meaning only one potential recording speed, no still image on screen when a tape is paused, less visual stability, and no shuttle mode, as in the ability to watch a tape being rewound or fast-forwarded on screen. Unlike any other consumer videotape format, certainly of the period, the entire head drum was attached with a single reverse-threaded screw. In other words, if you wanted to clean the head, you could simply remove it and gently clean it with an alcohol-soaked lens cloth or a fine chamois cloth or stick. Speaking of cleaning...
Oh, doesn't anybody give you your money's worth these days?
You asked for it. Your money's worth and more.
While I haven't gotten my hands on every old consumer videotape format yet, as it stands, I think I can safely say the VX VCR is the most frustratingly maintenance-intensive one of them all. I'm sure it wasn't as bad in its day, but these days, just as a baseline, after every 2 hours of use, it's gonna need a full cleaning. Unfortunately, to do so, you'll need to half-dismantle the machine. Very early in my own transfer process, I got sick of disassembling and reassembling the deck and just opted to use the thing in its skeletal form. Of course, there are those moments where a stray piece of oxide flakes off and near instantly clogs the machine, in which case you'll need to do an immediate cleaning. Anyway, aside from the usual cleaning of the head, ace assembly, guides, capstan, and pinch roller, more important than any of that, you'll need to de-gunk the hubs that the supply and take-up reels latch onto, and the hard plastic idler wheel assembly. To clean the hubs, you'll need to hold back the brake so you can rotate them freely. I'd strongly recommend investing in a big stash of long-stemmed cotton swabs for this process. By the way, the butt end of a used one is quite helpful while trying to hold back the aforementioned brake. To the same bank of videos that I've been hitting up for quite a while now, and the advice was to clean the idler tires and such. The reason you need to constantly clean the hubs and idlers is because the entire drive motor power depends on it. The drive motor, which is about the size of a can of cat food, needs enough torque to run the belt and deal with the excess weight of the cassette and the enclosed stacked reels of tape, and run said tape at just over 2 inches per second. To put this in further perspective, a VX cassette is the same width and length of a full-blown professional 3/4 inch U-matic cassette, and is about a ½ inch taller than the U-matic cassette. Of course, the weight of a U-matic tape is distributed just a little more evenly, and U-matic decks were a lot more powerful. If there's even a hint of torque shortage with a VX VCR, when starting playback, the machine will immediately trigger the auto stop/end of tape sensor. This is especially common when trying to start a 2-hour tape. Speaking of unforgiving, same old. The core area of the cassette, where the tape makes that 360-degree turn, is so tight that if there's a wrinkle or a bunch anywhere in the tape will jump the rails, so to speak, and jam up the VCR. Now, I've long been an advocate of not cutting and splicing consumer videotape, but when you encounter a bit of mangled VX tape, you have no option. One of the tapes, of course, that I acquired for this episode had this very problem. And yes, it arrived that way. And yes, it pays big time to open each tape you get of this format before you try and play it. Anyway, the process to repair a tape is long, tedious, and very easy to screw up. It's especially fun removing and replacing the cassette's plastic core by hand. If you're curious, the Rene Gonzalez channel on YouTube has an hour-plus long video on the repair process. Now, as for my tape, since I only had regular office Scotch tape on hand at the moment, I didn't even try and run that spliced portion through my deck. But thankfully, nothing too noteworthy was on that stretch anyway. Also, thankfully, the 2 feet or so I had to cut out of that tape was the only casualty of the entire project for me. You're supposed to turn on the rather noisy dehumidifier for 5 to 10 minutes. One especially amusing feature of the VR1000/VX2000 is the presence of a pretty noisy dehumidifier. If the service manual is anything to go by, this was designed to help acclimate the VCR to a new environment more quickly. While corporate logic would kind of dictate that this was to try and offset the lack of lubrication on the tapes, I'm going to guess that this was really an accommodation for those that would haul their machines to tape dubbing parties and such. The dehumidifier in my machine does power on, but I can't verify it does much of anything. And I have zero desire to haul a huge 44-pound VCR anywhere to put the acclimation theory to the test. You may have noticed in my transfers and most other VX transfers on YouTube that the bottom of the image on VX tapes is lost. Now, of course, at the time, you were likely watching on a CRT TV with no underscan feature and didn't even notice. I have 2 theories as to why this portion of the image is missing. One, it may have something to do with the sync pulses that are supposed to be recorded. Now, admittedly, I'm totally shooting in the dark here, but I think that might be where the sync pulses are. When I run my frame sync generator, all too often the picture gets shaky and some distortion is introduced. I'm wondering if my frame sync generator isn't getting confused by it. And if I may rant for a moment here, if I don't use my frame sync generator when I'm doing transfers, yeah, the image is more stable, but the video and audio keep falling farther and farther and farther out of sync with every little hiccup in the signal. As a side note, when I try to use a standalone time-based corrector, I lose almost all color. Anyway, moving on. Theory number 2, the single head recording and playback system was simply too weak to scan the entire image fast enough. Since I tend to be a pretty strong believer in Occam's razor, I'm quite inclined to believe it's theory number 2.
I hate the mold that builds up on this hard-to-get-at grout.
Now there's a brand new kind of cleanser.
As I mentioned in the intro, I managed to accrue 15 VX format tapes over the last 5 months or so, and 2 of them are from Japan. And if you saw last week's video, you know I'm a little stuck on what I can share from those tapes. But anyway, unfortunately, as is kind of the norm when I manage to get my hands on batches of Betamax and VHS tapes from the late 70s and early 80s, they tend to be pretty light on ephemera. And that's because the norm at the time was for the people to record these things to usually be members of the, as I call it, Commercial Cutter Society. Now, that's not to say I didn't get some commercials in here, and I even got a little local news in here, but I guess it's more the content that's really noteworthy here. Having said that, I do actually have some footage, and it might be the only footage, because I can't find any anywhere, from a kind of Z Channel-esque movie channel, if you're familiar with the old Z Channel in LA during the 70s and 80s. But I guess to me the really noteworthy thing was from some kind of weird one-off variety show. And unfortunately, the original recorder didn't just cut out the commercials, they cut out the bumpers and a good chunk of the show. So I don't even know the name of it. But in that footage, we're treated to a truly unique rendition of the disco classic, I Will Survive, as performed by Taxi co-star Mary Lou Henner.
In 1978, the first-run movies are great on the cable. Film hits premiere week after week. You'll want to see all of them at least once, and some of them several times. Beginning next Friday on the G Channel, you can expect soaring adventure in Skyriders.
Energy crisis.
At first I was afraid, I was petrified.
Now I wash everything in Dynamo.
The little blue jug is Dynamo.
Recommended by women who used to use powders.
Ready to celebrate our anniversary?
You're not ready, Larry.
Ever tasted real barbecue pork chops? Well, I fix them mighty tasty on my grill.
For temporary relief of hemorrhoid symptoms, get doctor-tested Preparation H. Goes beyond soothing, helps shrink swelling of hemorrhoidal tissues.
Don't waste your time.
And I learned how to get along, and so we are back from outer space. I just walked in to find you here with that sad look upon your face.
Funny woman.
Pushing me all over town like a dog, I take it.
Perfect cake, then cleans with a touch. We give you the cookie sheet. Ever have cookies get stubborn? With Clearstone, they just slide off the sheet. Spilled batter cleans instantly. What is Clearstone? Watch these amazing comparisons. These cupcakes are all over-baked. On the left is an ordinary bake pan. On the right, Clearstone. Why, even Grandma would throw away this pan.
While you're eating your turkey and pumpkin pie, the folks at Name Brand will be busy marking down every single item for Name Brand's weekend warehouse sale. Then starting Friday morning at 10 o'clock a.m., the giant sale begins. Beanbag chairs are reduced to just $10.
You can't cook on a diamond. You can cook on Armor Coat.
Single record of the year is Lucille by Kenny Rogers.
The album of the year is Kenny Rogers by Kenny Rogers. Lucille by Kenny Rogers.
Oh, it's 2 in the morning. I'm running and she wants to walk.
Guess who?
Kenny Rogers.
The entertainer of the year is Dolly Parton.
To see that he doesn't get into trouble. There's the Ike out at sea. Marlowe's been on the ship for a week now, doing a great job.
Sorry. Listen, Davey, fish like this will kill you. If you'd had the harness on it and pull you right over the side.
What do I do now?
I think I'd hit him.
A beautiful brass-plated headboard. It's your gift when you buy this famous Ortho King, Queen, Twin, or full-size set. Look how little you pay for this beautiful king-size set. Get your brass-plated headboard before the offer ends.
I will survive, I will survive, I will survive, I will survive.
Well, that's going to be it for today's archive. And that's going to be it for Season 11 of Oddity Archive. So as always, I'm going to step back for a few weeks, refrain from making full-blown proper archive episodes for a little while, and try and work on some other projects around here. But as always, you will not be hurting for new material. I really hope to get finally this year's first archive thrifting episode out the door. 1 week I will turn things over to my little radio station, KLAK 640 AM, and let my old ex-Soviet DJ buddy Sergey do one of his little Catacomb of Classics shows, or Kittycomb as he pronounces it for some reason. There'll be a Ben's Junk or two and just kind of whatever other stuff. This is also the season where I post my harvest, if you will, from the past year of commercial breaks and other ephemera to the Archive Annex channel. Otherwise, as for me personally this summer, I've got 2 projects that I really want to undertake here. One being finally finishing up the Oddity Archive soundtrack album that I've been chipping away at for the last 4 years now. I still have 2 more songs that I want to take a stab at, so I'm gonna do that. Whether or not they make the cut is anyone's guess, but I gotta try. And otherwise, I'm gonna head back into Minnesota at some point and try and redeem myself from the debacle that was the AM Stereo episode last summer. So if all goes according to plan, season 12 of Archive will kick off with AM Stereo Redo that last week of July. Otherwise, that's going to be it for me. I'll talk to you again soon.
You think I'd lay down and I will survive. I will survive. Oh, as long as I know how to love, I know I'll stay alive. I've got all my life to live. I've got all my love to give. I'll survive. I will survive. I will survive. I will survive. I will survive.
Maybe I'll be patient for a while. Okay?
Okay.